afternoon, and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Native Bees of Missouri's Ozark Woodlands and Glades with Ken McCarty. My name is Erica. I am the Special Projects Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen. And at the end, MPF Executive Director Carol David will read those out to Ken. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared with all of you on Friday, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. Ken McCarty is the Natural Resource Program Director for Missouri State Parks, where he has worked for 37 years. His 42-year professional career has emphasized designated Missouri natural areas and native ecosystems. He has focused on preserving, restoring, managing, and monitoring them, along with establishing policies and practices to sustain the natural environments throughout Missouri's robust state park system, with a particular focus on Ozark woodlands and glades. His career-spanning interest in native flora and natural community ecology includes considerable experience with fire and native systems. More recently, Ken has been exploring the native bee community as yet another fascinating aspect of our natural world. And now I'll turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, Erica and Carol, for the invite, and I appreciate everybody who's here today to kind of join with me on this exploration of bees and bee communities across some of our most spectacular native landscapes in the Ozarks. I have been collecting bees since 2016 from some of our best nature places in state parks, and what I can offer you today is the accumulated results of the numbers of bees, the kinds of ways that they distribute across the landscape, and so forth, and other kinds of characteristics. And since 2016, when I started prowling the kinds of landscapes that you see behind you there in that scene, which happens to be Roaring River State Park, I have also given a lot of bee demonstrations. I've taken my collections and my microscopes and display materials to different kind of public events, and I had a lot of interaction with different kinds of peoples and seeing the kind of things that interest them about bees. And probably second behind the carpenter bees that are destroying people's decks, the conversation and the interest has been just in the sheer numbers of bees that exist in Missouri. That's something that most people don't anticipate, given their experience and the familiar bees with the honeybees, the bumblebees, and so forth. But worldwide, there are 20,000 species of bees. In the United States alone, there's 4,000 species of bees. If we were to zoom this in closer to Missouri, the central U.S., you're looking at about 1,800 different kinds of bees that persist or exist across the landscape. And then if you were to bring this down to Missouri, there are about 490 different kinds of bees that inhabit the different environments of Missouri. And those environments are quite varied. And from the one end of the spectrum, which is our very high quality natural landscapes, especially those big natural vegetation areas across the Ozark region, much of Missouri and most of the landscapes that you and I are familiar with in our daily lives are going to be one or another of the kind of landscapes represented on these three maps. The urban and suburban zones, the agricultural zones, whether it's the lighter tan with the fescue or the pastures and the cattle systems, or if it's the darker, which are the agricultural systems. And then there's the forests, which themselves have changed a lot from their native character. And all of these bring the questions of conservation of our native bees, of their presence, their species richness, their dynamics, their different kind of conservation measures that are represented by these three logos, the different kinds of initiatives that have developed over the past several years to try and address some of the questions of bee habitat, bee floral presence for the bees, and so forth. Now, at the other end of the spectrum are the kinds of landscapes that I've been collecting bees from. Across different parts of Missouri, and especially across our Ozark region, we have large areas of native vegetation where we find a very high floristic abundance, floristic richness. We find across those landscapes a high degree of natural community, variety, and variability. And we find areas where the patches of natural vegetation are actually quite large. They are the landscape. And if I were to hone in on the kind of results I'll be presenting to you here in a little bit, and take it beyond just the large areas of native vegetation to more specifically the high quality Ozark natural areas. Here I'll use the state parks, which is where I've done the survey. And I would just ask you to consider that the state park system is over 100 years old. Most of the big scenic nature spots were selected because they had nature present at the time. And through the decades, they've been managed as nature preserves and just sustaining and even accruing the kinds of diversity that relates to our original natural heritage. And beginning in the 1970s, 1980s, there was a very growing awareness and an interest in cataloging all of nature that existed on these parks. And with our mission to preserve Missouri's outstanding natural landscapes, we invested much through the 1980s and 90s all the way up to the present towards finding the best of these spots and bringing out the best in them through our different prescribed fire programs, our restoration programs, invasive species control, and so forth. So what we have here in the format for the bee survey that I've done are some of the very best expressions of our native natural environments that exist in the Ozarks. And what I will do for you today is to go briefly through what those native landscapes are, their character, their flora. I'll talk a little bit about what the bee survey was, and I'll get into what the bee community is, and then spend a big part of the time that we'll have today looking at some of the characteristics of the bee community, such as outlined here. Now, any story about bees, and especially bees in natural settings, is going to be inseparably intertwined with the story of the flora that bee community exists or persists with or in association with. Missouri has over 2,000 native taxa, and of these, about 45% are considered to be conservative or are moderately or highly associated with high quality natural communities and native remnants. You can take that same flora and look, because those kinds of high quality natural communities and remnants are somewhat sparse in so many areas today. 539, about a quarter of those species are considered to be species of conservation concern. So if you're looking to find the kind of bee community that reflects the original versions of our natural history of our native woodland and glade and prairie communities in the Ozarks, you're going to be going to some of the kind of spots like I reference here. And over the years, the interest in these kinds of great nature places in these state parks is, of course, has been very high. It's attracted a lot of scientific interest. Through those days and years, there have been a lot of master's projects that have come out looking at floras of these different parks. And from that, I can start describing the kind of floral community that supports the bee communities that I will talk about next. And you can, for these Bennett Springs, Bryant Creek, Hahatonka, Holland, all these kinds of great places in nature that we have in the state parks, and there's parallels on conservation lands, national forests, and so on. But you're looking at 600 to 700 to 800 to the record is over 940 species of vascular plant taxa at Bryant Creek State Park. So you're looking at 600 to 900 plus species that will be available. And you might contrast with what you might expect to find, say, in a more modern urban landscape or a pastoral landscape or some of the pollinator planting and so forth that we give. There's a lot of species in these native remnant Ozark landscapes to support a bee community. Now, of course, the sheer numbers of these is one aspect of that. Another thing to think about as you look at the numbers of plants that are present in a given setting is that each of those is going to have a fairly short blooming period. And those blooming periods are going to span the growing season. And with so many, there's going to be much depth in the blooming that occurs across these landscapes with lots of overlapping blooming periods that's there to support a bee community from March all the way through frost in November. And then one other aspect of our native natural Ozark woodland and glade landscapes is the density of these native plants on the landscapes. And from the sampling that we've done over the years, we're looking at our open woodlands typically in a 1/4 by 1/4 meter plot, about a little over 1.5 by 1.5 feet. In an open woodlands, typically you'll find 18 to 20 species just in that little square. And that's an average for all the little squares that you test across that landscape. And the Bennett Springs Savanna that's showing behind as the backdrop to the screen is a good reference point for that. The very rich sites have proven to have 25 and even more species in a 1/4 meter square. In the more closed woodlands, where the canopy has tightened up some and you have more shade and so forth, the richer ones will have 18 to 20 species. It'll drop down to 10 to 12 and 4 to 6 in some of the more sparse. But the point here is besides many, many, many species of flowering plants, 80% of which will be insect or animal pollinated, that you have a very high density of plants. And put those things together and you're going to expect that there is opportunity for a lot of bee species in a very rich and robust bee community. And I'll zoom in just a moment to just pick one park, my current favorite, actually one of our newest. Here, you look at one site, it's 3,000 acres in size. It has 940 vascular plant species. And those vascular plants are not random across the landscape, but they're organized to different landforms, soils, moistures, and so forth into discrete natural communities. So there's a very high matrix, a rich matrix of natural communities that supports these 940 vascular plants. And that's typical for the kinds of landscapes from which I collected the bees that provide the data for this survey. Now I want to zoom out as well. We talked the natural communities. I said Bryant Creek had just in that 3,000 acres, 30 natural communities. That's 1/3 of the entirety of the natural community types that exist in Missouri as a whole across those 4 ecological sections. The survey that I'm presenting results for occurred in the Ozark Highlands, but I wanted to try to get to a sense of what the landscapes themselves are like in which these bees are inhabited, and I did the collecting. And if you look at the different shades of green, and you compare the shades of green on the map with the shades of green on the index bar, essentially what you're getting is a loose measure of the tree density across the landscape. And you can see where the prairies existed across northern and western Missouri in particular, but pay attention to that I-44 corridor, the Highway 67, I-55, and you'll see also a sprinkling of those prairie landscapes through the Ozarks as well, and especially as you get more towards the western side of the Ozarks. And then to go the other side of the spectrum, you're looking at the deepest greens, and of course the Mississippi Alluvial Basin with the bottom of hardwood forest and swamps has a lot of green. But the deep green, which represents the classic forest, is fairly limited, and it's weighted more towards those very dissected landscapes and towards the eastern and the southern Ozarks, although they are present in different ways across the state, but probably not to the extent that people expect if they imagine what Missouri was prehistorically. And then there's all the shades of green in between. And these represent the different degrees of woodlands, often the shallow soil, stunted growth, kind of post oak, black oak, jack oak flats were called barrens. There were flat woods over some of these clay pan soils with the seasonal water and seasonal dryness. There's the the different kinds of woodlands that existed across the hillsides of the Ozarks. And the purpose of showing this slide is to emphasize that there's a broad range of landscape types, and there's a high density of natural community types, which are variations on those major themes that exist all across the Ozarks. And that's important in understanding the diversity and variety of bees that I've been able to find. And so a brief run through on those using the various sites that I collected the bees from. You look at first the most prairie-like, the prairie openings themselves with that very intriguing remnant at like the Ozark State Parks, the savannas, the flatwoods, and then those are all ridgetop kinds of things. Then across all those Ozark hillsides where those thick outcrops of rock occur, you get these very prairie-like glades. And that vegetation is reminiscent, of course, of prairies. But as I have found, the many of the bee species that occur on those landscapes are reminiscent of the tallgrass prairie as well. Then those woodlands, the medium shades of grain, then I told you about, where you have tree canopies, the tree density that starts to close in. You may have a fairly tight canopy, but there's a very open mid-story, and because you have a very open or understory tree layer, you often have a very rich herbaceous layer, rich in species and so forth. Further down, and these are the deep greens on that vegetation map, you have the classic forest, where you have a really strong spring flower abundance, including many of the flowering trees and shrubs and vines. You have a fall flower experience, and in between, you tend to have a very little through those summer months. And these, it's a third kind of major natural community type that exists in these Ozark landscapes, integrated with those other two. And then there's a fourth that I came to appreciate much more as I was doing the bee collecting. And those are our different creeks and rivers and streams that course through these Ozark landscapes. And of course, there is a water source, and I'm sure the bees appreciate that as much as our park visitors do. But the other part of it that is noted is the flooding that happens there, and the seasonal drawdowns and so forth. The streams and rivers leave a corridor of light through these otherwise forested systems, and it's abundant light. And that abundant light, with those deep soils and abundant water, they provide a season-long, high-density floral abundance that is much utilized by the bee community. And they really are another bee habitat that exists in our Ozark landscapes. So with that for context, we'll move on briefly to what the survey itself was. And you see a map across the Ozarks and Ozark border region. You see 17 dots representing the parks where the survey took place. You see 7 large red circles. Those are the major Ozark landscape parks, where I call them the focus parks, where I concentrated the survey. And I sampled at 2 to 3 week intervals through the entire growing season in different years. And then in subsequent years, I would come back and try to fill gaps in dates or some of the more significant plants to fill in some of the data gaps. And in collecting that data, I was, of course, getting the bee species, and I was associating with the natural community. And these were all collected with the net so that I could make an association with that native or natural community, and very specifically with the host plant. So the database records will have the species, natural community, the host plant data, and other information. And in doing so, the objective for this, given these landscapes that we have captured in state parks and we valued for so long, and we preserve and we interpret and we manage and care for, and we know so much about them from the plant perspective and how those plants organize across the landscape. But the interest here was to look at the other side, look into the flower rather than across it, and to just be fascinated by the amount of life that's there. And with the interest in the bees and the bee conservation was to hone in specifically on the bee community that exists in these large native landscapes with these high quality natural communities that have a high degree of floral richness and represent the native natural landscapes of the Ozarks. And that said, let's take a look at the bees, starting with just some of the statistics associated with the survey. To begin with, you remember there were 490 species of bees recognized in Missouri. Through the 8 years of this survey in those 17 sites, I was able to collect, document 264 species as being present in these woodland glade landscapes in these high quality nature state parks. Those bees were distributed across 5 families in good proportion. The cletids, of course, have much fewer species to begin with, so it appears not so many, but still all the families are very well represented across all these community types and these 17 different Ozark landscape parks. And given those 246 bees that were found, the next interesting question is, so at any one site, we profiled Bryant Creek, for example, but at any one site, how many bees might one expect given this level of sampling and collecting across them? And here I have the list with, you're looking at anywhere from 100 to 140 plus bees that were collected within those environments, those parks. And I lined it up with the number of plant species that are present as well. And I added Johnson Shut-in State Park. That's not one that I did. That's one that Mike Arduger did prior, but it was in a very similar fashion towards the same goals. And I thought it'd be interesting to add, especially since it was the high end of the bee species richness that I picked up in these different Ozark landscape parks. And when it comes to counting species and considering species diversity for any kind of organism, there's a general ecological rule that a key feature of life's diversity is that some species are common, but many more are rare. And I'd like to look at both sides of that phrase. And on the one side is that some species are common. That's been a very consistent finding in different surveys across different kinds of landscapes. That's why I brought the tractor back and some of the restorations and recreations and some of the smaller natural areas and all the different kind of landscapes we have. It is true that some species are common, and it's developed that there's really, as Mike Arduger has put it, a handful of widely distributed common generalists or pollination's heavy hitters. And so as we look at that side of it, we're going to say for whatever number of species that are there, there's going to be a few that you're going to recognize over and over in all these different situations across the state as being recognizable again, and they are going to be the very abundant kinds of species. And there can be a very high abundance in a lot of these different settings. Now, the other side of that statement is that many more are rare. And so in that case, in some of the more simplified, altered kinds of landscapes that we have today, you might think that the many more is relative, and that whole species list might start getting truncated quite a bit. As you drop off, you just don't have the kinds of diversity, you don't have the kind of plants that would support many of these rare, and what we'll call them to explain later as being more conservative bees. The commons can be there. The abundance of bee in general can be very high, but while those certain species are common, you're going to find that the list of rare ones might be truncated. So with that said, let's go to our native natural landscapes that are high quality natural areas. And of course, you can look at this. This is Hawatonka about 3 weeks ago as one example, and you can look across that and just think that, well, if there's any bee anywhere, it has to be either here now or headed here, because there is a lot of floral opportunity. Of course, it's represented by one very, very common species there. That's obvious in a park that we know has well over 600 native species present across its expanses. So, but to think in general, let's look again at a key feature of life's diversity is that some species are common, but many more are rare. And let's take the first half of that. Some species are common, and using the data from these 17 parks and over 6,000 records, there are 10 bee species that represented 25% of the whole collection record. And those 10 bee species were found at 74% of the 258 plant species that I collected bees from. And that's definitely a handful of widely distributed common generalists. Now I can enlarge the net just a little bit, and I can say the top 25 bee species. Going from 10 to 25, we've now captured almost half of the entire collection record, or the entire database is represented by these 25 species. And those 25 bee species are covering 81% of those 258 plant species. And so, again, you can say that there is a relatively small number of species that are highly abundant and are probably some of the pollinating generators in these natural systems. And then we'll switch to the other side of that equation and look at let me just say first that for those of you who recognize the Latin names, here's what those 25 are. You're looking to a few species of the minor bees, the andrinas. You're looking at the bumblebees, the 4 species of those, the honeybee, 3 species of the small carpenter bee, the eastern carpenter bee, the green metallic sweat bees, and 3 species of the leafcutter bees, one of the mason bees, and a resin bee. Those are the ones that in this survey were the most abundant, the most widely distributed across all those different parks and sites. But now let's go to the rare. If you take, I think I have, yes. So find 25 on that species abundance list, which would be about right here. And so 50% of the records and 84% of the plants were visited by this part of the spectrum. That leaves all this rest of species that were present in these systems and supported by that rich floral diversity we have and the kinds of communities and so forth. And if I were to consider those rarer bees, those uncommon bees, and especially if I were to look at those that were unique, that were captured one park or one time through the survey, those unique bees represented 70% of the conservative or the native remnant-dependent kinds of bee species in the entire survey. They represented 38% of the regionally uncommon or rare bees, and they were most of the undescribed, the first Missouri records, the endemic bees that I came up with prowling these big naturescapes in our state parks. So moving from there and start probing some of the details of that, I think the next step is to consider that these unique bees, these conservative bees, and so forth, and in fact, this whole kind of distribution pattern can relate in some degree to the pollen collecting strategy of the bees within the bee community of these parks. You will have species that are opportunistic. They're generalist feeders that will go to a broad range. Almost any kind of flowers is good for them. Then you will have specialist bees that are more narrowly focused on certain kinds of flowers and flowering plants for their pollen and nectar. And then you will have those that don't collect pollen at all. And those rare or those unique bees tend to be weighted very heavily towards those oligolectic types. But let's take a look at just what that proportion was throughout all 17 parks, all data combined. Across these Ozark woodland glade bee landscapes, about 1/2 of the bee species population or list were pollen generalists. Of the pollen specialists, there were about 31% of the bee species encountered were specializing on certain kinds of plants for that pollen and nectar. And there's degrees of specialization that exist within the bee community. One represented by the oblique longhorn bee here, one group will collect pollen from a very broad range, in this case, from members of the composite family, your sunflowers and coneflowers and so forth. A step more specialized would be represented by the Pseudopronergus, which collect pollen from a single genus, in this case, Rudbeckia. And then within that third of the oligolectic species that occur in the woodlands and glades are those that will collect pollen from just a single plant species. And there are several species of the Andrena, or the minor bees, that are like this, and very highly specialized. And you can imagine many of those unique bees, not this one, but many of those unique bees that are tied to plants that are very conservative, only found in native dependents, are going to be very sensitive to whether or not those plants are present at all. If you don't have the plants, you're not going to have the bees. And just planting it somewhere in a fescue pasture doesn't mean those bees will be there, because they're tied to that native remnant. Then there's those bees that don't collect pollen at all. They will, you can think of the cowbirds, for instance, and we have a substantial number, the 20% of the bee species in this Ozark Woodland Glade survey were actually these cleptoparasites, and they will collect no pollen. They will search out the nest of a host species, and they will lay their eggs in that nest and either kill the egg or larvae, or their larvae will do the same and grow up on that pollen meant for the other. So again, there's 20% of the species in the Ozark woodlands and glades that I encountered, was able to collect, were actually these kleptoparasites. And if you look at the proportions that make up the Ozark woodland glade landscape, about 50% of those 260 plus bees were pollen generalists. Not quite a third are pollen specialists, and 19, I said 20 earlier, percent are nest parasites. And in both cases, the pollen specialists and the nest parasites are high compared to a lot of other surveys, and it probably reflects the very high quality of these native remnant systems compared to some of the more general kinds of landscapes that bees exist in today. Move on to a couple of other bee community characteristics. Through the survey, looking at the species that were collected, about 3/4 of the species that were found in the woodlands and glades are ground nesters. That's higher than considered to be the typical average somewhat. I don't know the reason. It may, at least it'll be a good adaptation for these landscapes, which are very fire prone, and they're maintained in a product of natural fire cycles. And then above ground nesters, twigs and so forth, you're looking at about 1/4 of the population, with some overlap between the ground and above ground nesters. Rotted wood, 3% of the species, and there was one that nest in snail shells. When one thinks of all those hundreds of plants that exist on these Ozark landscapes, it's easy to recognize that there's blooming periods. And you go out in spring and you see one group of flowers in spectacular bloom. You go out in summer, there's another. In fall, there's still yet another population that's in bloom. Well, bees are very tied to the flowers. And so it's probably not a surprise that the bee community itself changes dramatically throughout the course of the season. And here's 3 graphs to help demonstrate that. You look at the top graph with the minor bees, the Andrenas, and you see from all the collection data through this survey that they were present through the year, but they definitely were a spring bee, peaking in April and May. You look at the bottom graph, the longhorn bees, those are bees that are summer, late summer into fall, especially tied to a lot of the composites, the sunflowers, the goldenrods, the asters, and so forth. And they're going to be out summer through fall. And then you look at others, some of those widely distributed generalists, for example, the small carpenter bees, those are out all season long. And that's three major patterns that exist. But you can do that for every one of those species that were collected here, and you put them all together, and it looks like this. And what you find is that the number of species, which is the scale on the left, that are present each month of the year at 2-week intervals. And you can see that the number of species grows rapidly in the spring as all those spring blooms, including all the shrubs and flowering trees and those ephemeral herbaceous plants. As they peak, so does the bee activity in terms of number of species, up to where in April into May, with this study, I had almost 120 species present during that time frame. And then it dropped off coming into the summer, but it didn't drop too far. You looked at a pretty steady, 60 to 80 species throughout the summer months, rising a bit into the late summer into fall before dropping off at the end of the season. And if you're looking for ways and traits that these high quality Ozark natural landscapes have that's maybe different from some of the other bee communities and other landscape types across the state or Midwest, this would be one, this sustaining this high number of bee species present through June and into July is something that is unusual for this study compared to other. And I throw up just one as an example. A more typical pattern that's been found in several of the surveys that have been done is that, yes, there is a high spring peak, but that it drops, that bee activity drops substantially, if not dramatically, into June before picking up again with when the summer flowers. You can think all the rosin weeds and compass plants and just everything else that comes on through midsummer. And then in some of them, to pick up a third peak that would be in fall, corresponding with a lot of the fall asters. So if you're looking for another difference that might reflect the kinds of communities that are here, and it probably relates to the depth in overlapping blooming periods from so many plants that occur on these native landscapes in the Ozarks, it would be this sustained activity through the season. And then I mentioned conservative bees. I've mentioned conservative plants from time to time through here. And I think that's an important thing when we're talking about these remnant, high quality, natural area kinds of systems in the Ozarks. Mike Arduza recently constructed a definition and scaled the bees that are known to exist in Missouri. That definition being a conservative bee is one that is a pollen specialist on a conservative plant group or species, or a pollen generalist that's repeatedly only found in certain habitat or community types. And so if you take that definition and go back to the bees that I collected on these 17 Ozark landscapes, you look at about 39% of those 264 Ozark species would be considered conservative, either moderately or highly associated with conservative plants and native remnant natural communities or certain habitat types. And to put that on a proportional scale with all the bees, the pie chart shows that slice of them that are considered to be conservative against the abundant, widely distributed generalist. And then you can take among those generalists, those 10 to 25 to 30 or 40 species that captured or that were most of the bees collected across the course of the study, and get a sense of how the bee community is organized in terms of their different kinds of specialties and habitat requirements. If we're going to talk about conservative bees, it's pretty interesting to talk about the conservative plants that exist in these as well, because these natural areas and natural systems are loaded with them. So if you take the remnant-dependent kinds of plants that are scaled on a 0 to 10, with 10 being the most conservative, and you say, okay, we've also got bees that are pollen generalists, and we've got bees that are pollen specialists. How does that relate to the plants that are either highly conservative or more matrix or more adventive? And you can see from the graphs, the green are the pollen generalist. The orange bars are the pollen specialist. And then you see the 0 to 10 scale, which is the plants, of which there were, I think, 248 different species of plants that I collected bees from. And you find that most of the bees, the highest numbers of bee species, were collected on the mid-range of plant conservatism. And to the question of is there a skewing of the specialist pollen specialist bees towards the most conservative plants, and you find that really no, they seem to track parallel with what the overall community is doing. And then we start looking at bee distributions. There were 243 of those species that I collected were collected within glade, woodland, and forest natural communities. And so you start asking the questions and wonder, just like plants will organize certain kind of plants or in one kind of community and so forth, you look at suites of birds that tend to key into certain community types or landscape types or habitat types. With all these bees present on these landscapes, do they do the same? And what these next couple series of graphs will show is that yes, here at the family level, you can see the leafcutter bees are proportionately high in the glades compared to their presence in forest and intermediate and woodlands. If you look down at the bottom, the red, you can see the reverse is true, that the numbers of andrinas in the glades are proportionally low compared to the forest environments where so many of those spring ephemerals that they specialize on, and the trees and flowering trees and shrubs and vines are very prolific. And then again, intermediate in the woodlands. Another way to look at this is to look at the proportion of the species that were collected in one or more of those communities and see how many or what proportion in the glades, which is the yellow. 63% of those 243 species were found in glades. 2/3 of them were found in woodlands, and a little over half of them were found in forests. And then to make this a little more real, by putting it on the landscape, on a landscape, about 1/3 of the entirety of all 264 bee species were found in any and all of those major community types, glades, forest, woodland. But there are also ones that were only found in one or the other. If, for instance, I had only collected on the glades, I would have missed those 11% that were only found in woodland, or those 12% that were only found in the forest. And some of the species, bee species richness values that I showed you early on, the ones with the most species of bees tended to be those with the greatest topographical relief, the greatest topographical complexity, and the greatest variety of natural community types, because there are bees that are associated with plants that are in one or the other of these kinds of landscapes. And then, just because it's fun, we'll sort of close out here. We recognize as managers, we see a lot of plants we really like to find in these areas that we manage as just park visitors or people heading out on hikes and in nature. We enjoy in our reconstructions and so forth. We like to see. And so, how do they stand up, and how many bees visit these? Here we look at the coneflowers. There were 32 bee species that I collected there, and I wasn't trying to collect every bee at every flower. This is just what my 6,000 plus records will show when I look at what plant that a particular bee was collected from. And so on the coneflowers, there were 4 species of them. There were 32 species of bees. 23 of those were generalists, and 9 of those were specialists. There were 2 species of the scurfy peas, and on those I collected 42 bee species, 32 of which were generalists, and 5 of which were pollen specialists. Lead plant, 45 bee species on that one, 40 of which are generalists, 5 of which were pollen specialists. The narrowleaf gumweed, 25 bee species, one of which is an endemic, one of which was a new Missouri record. And I hated to do it. And I was hoping time would run out before I had to. But at the very beginning, I was reluctant to even consider collecting bees from our exotic plants that occur in, unfortunately, strong numbers in a lot of these landscapes. But it proved to be a bee attractant as well. And it's an important part of our naturescapes today. And is understanding just the role that these exotic species play there. And so you look at the bar on the right, and you can see that there were over 80 of those 264 bee species that I collected on any kind of plant. I also collected on one of the non-native or the exotic species. And just as one example, we looked here at the spotted knapweed. There were 25 bee species collected on it. And I give a rundown of the different ones that were there, which includes some very conservative bees as well. And so with all that said, to summarize what we found or can find in our Ozark woodlands and glade landscapes based on these 17 parks and 8 years of my survey work, is that there are a large number of bee species that are present. 264 of Missouri's 490. That won't be the full total. It's just what this survey pulled up for the level and kind of sampling that I was doing. There are, in fact, just a few widespread pollen generalists that dominate that landscape. But there's also a very high proportion of pollen specialists. There's a high proportion of the parasitic, the nest parasites. And there's a high proportion of conservative and rare bees, which you would expect in these kinds of high quality natural systems. And you would not expect to be the same, and they're not, in some of the more contemporary kinds of simplified or altered landscapes that most of us and most of Missouri experiences today. And there's a sustained floral presence with depth and scope that supports a season-long bee activity. There's always a large number of species out and present at any given time of the year, even though weather conditions and other things may mean at one time or another you don't see them as often, but those species are definitely present and active in these natural systems across the full span of the growing season. And then one last observation here is that our characteristic woodland and glade plants each support many bee species. We mentioned before the role of those common generalists. They're very abundant through all of these, and they're ever present. Then you have a sprinkle among them these more conservative bees, or these habitat specialists or the floral specialists that you'll find. And then watching for them, you'll see all those cleptoparasites sneaking around, feeding from the flowers, but looking for those bee nests. It's a very diverse, it's a very rich, and it's a very dynamic kind of bee community that exists in these native Ozark landscapes. And it's a very valuable one, given that it's a reservoir of bee diversity that you don't find replicated in our simplified, our more contemporary kinds of living and working landscapes across the rest of the state. And it also, I think, has a lot to tell us, looking at what our best example of what a full and complete and healthy natural community with its bee population is, that can inform a lot of our different conservation efforts and practices today. And with one last slide, which is a shameless advertisement for our Missouri natural areas and the value that they bring to our conservation efforts in the state, I will yield the screen and turn it back over to you, Erica. Thank you.
Ken, that was amazing. Thank you very much. As one of the attendees said in the chat, amazing data and so well organized and presented. It was truly so well organized and presented. We do have a number of questions, which I will relay to you, Ken, from a number of folks. And this person had the same question I had when you were talking about the nesting behavior, and you mentioned that one species nests in snail shells. What species of bee is it?
It's a species of the osmia, the one of the mason bees that lives in these forests and where you have those snail shells. And then I caught it on my prairie restoration at home too this summer, which was venturing out, I think, from one of those settings because I burned that annually. I don't think there's many snail shells out on the prairie, but back in the woodlands along, yes, there was. So yes, it's one of our osmia or mason bees.
Thank you. Can you talk about the non-native honeybee and how to have conversations maybe with beekeepers or others? Is there an impact of honeybees on our native bees, and how do you navigate those kind of conversations if you meet, honeybee enthusiasts?
Sure. It was one of the questions I had going into this is just to what extent in a very healthy natural community that's shielded from a lot of our different living landscapes and our agriculture zones and so forth. But what I found throughout this entire study is that it is ubiquitous. It is present everywhere, anytime. It's one of the first ones out. It's one of the last ones in at night. And it's present in high numbers on a lot of the really high value nectar sources and scattered among most of those plants. So it has a very strong presence through all of these Ozark, woodland, glade, forest, riparian natural systems. And sometimes its presence is so high that you have trouble finding the native bees through all the activity and all the movement, and trying to catch one of the little native bees out of 15 of the honeybees is a challenge. So it's definitely present. The one aspect or one consideration on that is it has been present for some hundreds of years. And for whatever impact it has naturalized within this system, and there is still a bee community that exists and functions with it as a member. And I think that's a consideration. I think it's also a good note that the honeybee, with its ubiquitous presence and all the different kinds of pathogens that are present, it brings them en masse to the plants where all these solitary bees will gather for pollen as well, and brings them into contact. And there has to be some kind of interaction and challenge there that the honeybee brings to our native bee populations. There's competition for food resources, and there's definitely exposure to the different kinds of pathogen diseases that honeybees have and could transmit to our native populations. If you're trying to rationalize the honeybee's presence in our native landscapes, I think you have to recognize that the honeybee has long been very important in being managed for our different agricultural systems, and it's going to remain so. And as it moves into natural systems, again, it's been part of our landscapes for a long time, and those still persist. So I can note that, but I can also encourage and try to spread the word that for everything a honeybee does, especially when we move into our natural systems. And I've had even park superintendents say, can we or should we bring honeybee hives into the park? There's that kind of common understanding or misunderstanding that bees are in trouble, so all bees are in trouble everywhere. And one way to counter that is with these real high numbers of this colonial species of honeybee. And I think one answer to that is countering that perception. Another interesting fact, it did surprise me. Maybe I wasn't quite surprised that the honeybees are ubiquitous, but I was surprised for all that we fight exotic species in our natural systems, exotic plant species, exotic bees almost didn't exist. I had, I think, 4 encounters of 3 non-native species other than the honeybee in this entire survey for all these years.
Thank you. Another question, did all of the sites that you surveyed have similarly high bee numbers throughout the season? Also, where do the bees go when they're not out feeding?
So for those focus parks, those 7 focus parks where I had concentrated, I would take 1 to 2 day trips at 2 to 3 week intervals for each of those 7. And what I found across all of those, and they're very similar in their natural community types, they're that the bee presence was very similar across the board on those. And I would expect that the natural communities were very similar, even identical, even if the geography was different. And as I went from one year to the next, I had the same times of years, as I filled those in. So the bee species and the bee activity was very similar across them. Now you get some difference in the species list, which is going to be based in some large measure on the geography. You noticed in the map that I had a real heavy weighting towards the western Ozarks, and I was able to pick up several edge of range, even a New Missouri record that's an edge of range because I was over on that side of the state as opposed to, say, really concentrating over on the eastern side of the state. So there'll be a geographic difference in what bees there are. And there was another question there, but I forgot.
Where do the bees go when they're not out feeding?
Watching TV, things like that. Well, their adult above ground life is very short. You're looking at 2 to 3 weeks, and they're going to be out. The males will usually emerge first, and they're going to be circling and they're going to be waiting for the female's arrival. And a lot of them will overnight in or on flowers or foliage and things like that. The females are very active. As they come out, their mission is to find a site for and construct the nest. And if you take, for instance, a miner bee, that she's going to dig a tunnel that might be 8 inches, 12 inches deep, and she's going to have little side chambers, and she's going to spend her time collecting pollen, then she's going to come back to it, and she's going to spend her time shaping that pollen and nectar into a little ball, laying the eggs and lining it and doing all those kind of things to prepare for that next generation.
Thank you. There's a question from Jonathan. Greetings from the hill country of Texas. Are there any of the native bees that have a quote hive of more than a few individuals?
No. In fact, almost all of the bees are solitary. There's different kinds of social arrangements where you have purely solitary, and you can have different kinds of aggregations, usually related bees. On some of them may share a common entrance among related females, but have separate portions in it. There's also nesting clusters, and I'm sure in Texas you're familiar with some of those where you'll have an area that has many nest holes that go into the ground, each of which is occupied by one female. So you have different degrees of sociality, but you don't have any of the native bees that do anything like the honeybee.
Thank you. Another person asks, did you find the rusty patch bumblebee and on what plants? And you might explain about the conservation status of this species, Ken.
Yes, and the answer is no. In fact, I was outside the expected range for the federally endangered rusty patched bumblebee being southerly in the Ozarks, so I found none of those. The really common bumblebees that I encountered all across the Ozarks were the brown-belted, the two-spotted in the common eastern, and in most of those parks, especially those that had the more open grasslands, or even some I can think where I had these canopy gaps down at Bryant Creek that were very herbaceous. There I found the American bumblebee, and I found just a couple of the others, the less common ones, but none of the rusty patch.
Thank you. Can you describe what the bee, well, it says hives, so it may be nests, look like when they're on the ground versus in trees or in a snail shell?
Sure. There's some variety in what they would look like if they're solitary or an aggregate nester or something like that. But But for most of the ground nesters, what you're going to see is a hole in the ground. And that may have some kind of turret associated with it, or it may be just a simple hole in the ground. And you will see bees coming in and out of it, or a bee coming in and out of it, depending on what kind it is. So that would be your typical. And you can, there's some nice publications, of course, online, but there's a couple of publications. There's one in particular I can mention. I think this, whoa, where is it? There it is. This publication, which is Bees and Identification, a Native Plant Forage Guide by Heather Holm, has some outstanding pictures and diagrams of different kinds of bee nests, and there is a lot of variety among them. Just how an individual species may construct that nest, how it lines it. A lot of the twig nesters, for instance, some of them will line and separate partitions with plant resins. Some of them, the leaf cutters, will line it with segments of leaves and flower petals. The cellophane or plaster bees will coat it with a polymer that turns very cellophane-like and waterproofs. There's a lot of variety in how those are, but that's one excellent publication that has some outstanding pictures. I use a lot in my demonstrations when people ask that kind of question.
Thank you. Here's a question. Is there any interest in expanding your rigorous sampling effort across the rest of the state in other ecoregions? And will you be continuing this effort in the currently sampled areas? Long-term data sets are, of course, incredibly important as we further progress into a changing landscapes.
Agreed, 100%. I think one of the most valuable things we can do is get a good record of bee presence, what species are and what the situation and what the host plants are. It's a very challenging thing to do. I came into this as a botanist and ecologist, and I came into it thinking, well, just like plants, I'll lay out a tape and I'll have little points along it and I'll see what bees are there, and we got it. It doesn't work that way. Bee populations are very dynamic. Even identifying the different species is quite a challenge. It's quite a specialty. And I used to, I don't know if it's a joke or not, I used to say that I could write a bee book and illustrate it with 3 bee photos. I just arrange them in different ways, and who would know the difference? I wouldn't. But they're very challenging to learn to identify, and they're very challenging to identify with precision. You can get it narrowed down, and you can pick out certain species, but to actually get an absolute list of what species are there just really can't be done from looking at them on the flower. So it takes a lot of effort to do this, and the data that I put together here, it was kind of scary when I did this, but I did it anyway. I just said, okay, how many days was I actually out there? And it was well over 800. And so if you think that's every day for what's 800, I mean, no, it's not, wasn't 8. Oh, what was it? Well, essentially it's 8 months is what it turned out to be. 8 months strung end to end, day to day is what this data represents if I compressed it all into a single calendar year. And that was to get this volume of data. So it takes a lot of effort to pull this kind of thing together, and that doesn't even begin to say the time spent with the microscope and so on and so forth, which is unfortunate because the knowledge we need is exactly that, is broader in scope, more precise in depth for the landscapes even I did, is to understand what bees are there and some of the dynamics across the years and seasons. That's crucial to bee conservation. It's these natural areas and these kind of landscapes that'll give you a reference point. But you also need, and it's happening, there are many others that are picking up on surveys, across different kinds of situations. And I think a lot of people here are aware of a lot of those. And so we're accruing those. My own plans, my own preference, I'm at a watershed. I can't decide, should I branch out and do more parks across a broader spectrum of the Ozarks, which I would love to do, or should I focus on these ones I have and dig even deeper, to fill in even more of the plant data, even more of the gaps at one park or another, to now that I've gotten so many of the common and semi-common, focus more on those that are rare and might be expected, you know, there's a lot of different ways to go with this, and I really haven't decided myself.
Well, it's wonderful that you have the support of state parks to do this and that you devoted so much of your time to this. It really is, you know, a gift to the state to have, you know, your data, and I hope it's backed up in numerous ways. I mean, physically backed up.
It is, trust me.
Great, great. And I just wanted to add that while they may not be, well, they the same kind of intensity of the studies that you did, there are bee studies, surveys that have documented bee species in prairies in Missouri, and we have some links to that information that we can share in an email that, as Erica said, would go out on Friday. We still have some more questions if you're willing to stay on and answer them.
I'm good. Sure.
As a follow-up to that question is, what was the most rewarding part for you personally of your bee collection or your, you know, process of collecting the information?
Well, you know, the most fascinating part of this, besides being able to be a naturalist again and a little bit less of an administrator, you know, if you're going to spend time surveying bees, you're going to be out in the best nature spots at their most florific time of year, the best flower shows and the best spots. And to me, that was the most rewarding part of it all. And then if I would add to that, I would say it would be, it's easy to appreciate nature at the macro scale with all the blooms stretching across the landscape like you look at in the slide, and the birds and the mammals and things you can see relatively easily. But when you stop to look into the flower, as you have to do if you're doing these bee survey, the world of the insects and the other invertebrates is absolutely fascinating. But it takes that time to see and understand just what all is happening then. And that would have to be beyond just being out in those kind of spots at their prettiest times and blooms, would be discovering that whole nother world that exists at the invertebrate level in these natural landscapes.
There's a couple of other questions about your study. Have you written a paper that covers your research, your surveys?
It's happening. Where I'm at now, and some of those that have seen some of the previous presentations might know some of the numbers have changed. It's changed because I've added to the data. And I've reached the end. Mike Arducer's been, in fact, this whole thing wouldn't have happened without Mike's help. He's coached and he's helped verify these different species and in so many different ways been part of this. But you know, through that assistance and work, I've reached the end of the determinations, and I've gone through a lot of different analyses to get to this point, and I'm wrapping those up. One challenge has been every time I just couldn't resist and went out and collected one more series of bees, I had to go through every kind of chart and data analysis all over again. And so I've made myself stop. I'm surveying bees on my own little prairie at home now, so I won't add to this data set. And I'm in the process of wrapping up the data analysis, and developing the storyline that I will. Yes, the intent of the whole project was on these best of type nature spots in our state parks at this point in time to have a record, a good record of the bees that were present in these natural areas and native landscapes. And that becomes valuable when the information gets published, and that's my next step. And then B, when those bees become part of a scientific record, and intends to send that collection to a museum so they can have some durability and availability for science.
Well, I also wanted to ask if you could write an article about this for the Missouri Prairie Journal, and I hope you'll say yes.
Well, I can do, I guess, in front of a lot of witnesses here.
Yeah, that's part of my strategy. Wonderful. There's another question about the specimens. I think you just said you did capture the specimens and you pinned them for ideas. You said quite a lot of microscope work, and you're saying you want to transfer your collection. Could you just repeat that again, please?
Yes, when it's finished and when all the data is collected and the different kinds of papers that I want to pull out of it are taken care of, the intent is to send it to some entomology museum where it will have, longevity and be available for the scientific record. As all the time I was sitting and spending all that time with the microscope and penning and labeling and catching and everything else. It's in my mind. It's only worth it if you get the information and make it available, and if that collection can persist as a record in time. And I think that's important for all our bee work that people are doing now.
Thank you. There's a question about, you had mentioned that native bees can become exposed to the pathogens that honeybees can harbor. And there's a comment that honeybees are also exposed to pathogens that exist on native bees. Do you have more information about that?
Nope, I can't help on that one. Sorry.
Thank you. A question, there's a number of questions about supporting bees at home, and I'll get to those in just a moment, but there's one question that pertains to the slide that you have up on your screen. Someone asked, how do you know that a Mead's milkweed is 100 years old?
Well, that's a projection. I took a little poetic license there. Maybe it's 2 years old, but they are long-lived plants.
Yes.
And so to make the words flow, I picked 100.
Okay, great. There's a couple questions about the bee houses that you can buy that are made up of maybe bamboo or other hollow cylinders. Are those useful, or would you recommend buying those or making them yourself?
Let's move a little outside my area. I've worked a lot with our natural areas and natural landscapes and the survey work and so forth. But I do know that they definitely will attract bees, and it's definitely interesting to be able to watch and see that kind of activity. And for that reason, they can be very nice to have around your house, much like people put bird houses and bird feeders up. If you move out of the native landscape, I don't consider them very necessary, because those native landscapes have all kinds of nesting environment. But you move out of those native landscapes into our urban landscapes and other kinds of very simplified or converted or altered, I think they have a role, and definitely for just interpretation and enjoyment.
Yes, I have a neighbor who gave me one of those, and I put it up because I was curious. And in fact, yes, native bees made nests in them. But as you say, where we live may not be next to a large state park. We may live in a suburban or an urban area or a rural area that's been dramatically changed. But there are so many ways that we can provide habitat at home for native bees, and through planting of native plants and leaving spent stems up over winter and in spring as nesting sites. Do you want to comment more on what people can do at home, Ken?
Oh, absolutely. And that's, you see so much in the popular conservation literature about different ways to improve habitats and bee presence at your homes. And certainly native plantings. What I found in our native landscapes, I think the concept is true in any kind of landscapes. The bee presence, bee abundance is across the season is going to be related to the flower. And it's how many flowers do you have? How many species do they represent? And is there a gap from one bloom cycle to another? Solve those problems, and you're going to have much better success in attracting bees to, whether it be to, your home or your local, community, or whether it be in some roadsides or some of the agricultural pollinator plantings, things like that. You're going to look for those kinds of problems to solve.
And we have a number of resources at our grownative.org website, and we can make sure we include some links in the email that goes out to you, including a graphic developed by Heather Holm and some of her colleagues that illustrates how important it is to leave those standing dead stems of plants over winter and through the next growing season. A couple of other questions. Do bees always dig their own holes for a nest, or would they use holes created by other creatures like cicadas or voles, for example?
Oh, sure. Sure. They're very opportunistic, a lot of these species, in finding and using, beetle burrows, and I sat on glade at Hawatonka through this and just intrigued, watch a female leafcutter bee prowling up and down the face of a rock outcrop looking for just the right crevice to make her nest in. And there's a lot of different situations, and no, they don't have to build their own nest. In fact, very often don't.
So it is illustrated by those bee boxes that people buy too.
Sure.
But I like what you said about watching the bee find the exact size crevice. It's amazing how much we can observe and learn if we stop and be still in just one spot in nature, isn't it?
It is.
Barbara asked a question about, is it necessary to leave open soil for bees? I know that we don't advise really thick, heavy mulch, wood mulch, that is, around native plantings for a number of reasons. And one being that bees can't then access the soil. How important is it? Or do bees find open soil just between, plants? Or do you need to leave, bigger areas of open soil for them, for the ground nesting bees?
One attribute of a healthy bee community, of course, is the floral richness and abundance and diversity, but the other is habitat availability, and that is important. And again, this is moving outside of my natural area zone, but as I read and experience them, I think I would agree that it is quite important that you do have space for them to be able to nest.
Thank you. You mentioned about the use of invasive non-native plants as pollen and nectar sources, and you showed the photo of the spotted knapweed. There's a question, did there seem, in the work that you did you see a preference for a specific non-native invasive plant among species?
No, I did not see a preference for one. I don't know that I was actually trying to look or document one, so I may not really be able to fairly answer that question. I do know that the bee presence at different ones was discouragingly high. And like I said, it took me quite a while before I as garlic mustard at Lake Ozarks. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. And said, well, I need to do it. And so I did. But so many of these exotics plants that we fight are very attracted pollinators, and that may explain why they're so successful. That they very high pollination rates, very high seed rates, and very good dispersal mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And it may be helped by the bees. And certainly I saw lots and lots of activity. And I can't say, there were any that would be insect pollinated that I didn't find a lot of activity on at one time or another.
And I know what you're saying. That's sort of distressing for those of us who love native flora, but could one not also say that were that invasive plant not there, there could be native flowers occupying that space? So it's not that maybe it's not that the invasives are creating an additional food source, but a food source because they're growing in a place where native flora might have been. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And you take it one step further and saying that in occupying that space as a generalist species that attracts a lot, they may be precluding some of the very conservative plants in these native remnants where you would have some of those very conservative specialists that might require that plant. And so that's a conservation issue or aspect of it there. And it also is one very good reason for combating these invasives in our natural areas. It's not just about the plant world, but the cascade of effects it has on the bees and other pollinators, other invertebrates, and other life forms in those systems.
Yes, thank you. One final question, and you did cover this, but there was so much information. I think it would be helpful if you could explain it again. There's not, we might think, oh, rare bees will visit rare plants, or remnant-dependent conservative bees will visit remnant-dependent rare plants. But that's not always the case, is it? There can be common bees visiting rare plants and rare bees visiting common plants. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I did not find a strong association. I mean, definitely there are conservative plants that are dependent on conservative bees that are dependent on remnants like this. And you will find those conservative plants that they require in these kinds of areas. I mean, that's very true. But I think a couple of slides, and I could even go back, it might be worth doing that. Oh, there it is. Didn't have to go back too far. Well, here's one. I mean, just consider, things like lead plants. Part of your question was, will common bees go to conservative plants? And as I go across that spectrum, all these plants attract a lot of different kinds of bees, and some of them are just bee magnets. And conservative or matrix or ruderal, doesn't matter. They all attract a lot of different kinds of bees. But that association with conservative plants, there's the graph. And so you're looking at 0 to 10 on the plant coefficient of conservatism scale. And then you're looking at numbers of bee species, green being your generalist and orange being your pollen specialist. And so to the first part of your question, you don't see the orange skewed all the way over there to the 8s and 9s and 10s at all. You find that the ratio of pollen specialist to generalist is pretty consistent regardless of the coefficient of conservatism.
Thank you, Ken. We don't have any more questions, but thank you so much for this incredibly well-presented information, and there are many, many accolades to you in the chat. Everyone, thank you for tuning in today. And as I mentioned, we will be getting an email out to you. Erica is excellent at doing this on Friday with a number of resources that were covered today. And we'll have links to some other bee information from the Missouri Prairie Foundation. I want to invite everyone to sign up and register for our masterclass on swallowtail butterflies on July 17 with Betsy Betros. We have other upcoming events, a Bumblebee Atlas training near Kansas City on July 20th, a in-person hike to a very diverse prairie in Illinois on July 20th. We have our annual dinner in Columbia, Missouri with Dr. Chris Barnhart on regal fritillary conservation. So lots of insect themed events coming up. Thanks again, everyone, for participating, and thank you, Ken. And Ken is another reason why our Missouri State Park system is so amazing. Amazing resources, amazingly dedicated biologists like Ken. Thank you very much, and have a good evening and a good 4th of July, everyone. Goodbye.